What if I told you that Colombo, Sri Lanka's bustling commercial capital, was once home to a powerful African community? Warriors, mercenaries, and rulers who within 2 centuries were reduced to mere slaves. And what if I told you that in the heart of Colombo there once existed a prison island surrounded by crocodile infested waters designed to trap and isolate enslaved Africans, making escape almost impossible? That island is what most Sri Lankans still call Slave Island, a commercial neighborhood today, but a name that carries the weight of a dark and forgotten past. Have you ever stopped to wonder why it is called Slave Island? Who were these enslaved people? Where did they actually come from? And more importantly, who built the forts in Colombo, Galle, and Trincomalee? Well, stay with me as we answer all these questions and dive deep into this hidden and forgotten chapter of history, uncovering the brutal realities of African slavery in Sri Lanka and the shocking truth behind the very forts, cities, and landmarks we admire today, built on the backs of those who were never given a choice. Long before the Portuguese, Dutch, and British set foot on Sri Lankan soil, Colombo was ruled by a powerful sea lord, Jalasti, also known as Khwaja Jahan or Koya Jan. In the 14th century, he commanded the city with an iron grip, leading an army unlike any other. According to the famed Moroccan explorer Ibn Battuta, Jalasti's forces included 500 elite Habshi warriors, Abyssinians from present-day Ethiopia and Eritrea, who served as his personal guards and enforcers. But there is more to this mysterious figure. Another traveller, Giovanni de Marignoli, also known as John of Florence, offers a very different account. He identifies Jalasti as a ruthless pirate, an enigmatic eunuch who preyed on passing ships, looting their treasures and striking fear into the hearts of sailors. Historical records also reveal that Abyssinian and East African merchants and pilgrims had been journeying to Sri Lanka for centuries, long before the arrival of European colonizers. Even colonial writers observed that Ethiopian pilgrims, including royalty, held deep reverence for Adam's Peak, Siripada, making the sacred mountain a destination not just for Africans but also for Persians, Arabs, and Indians who sought its spiritual significance. But everything changed when the Europeans arrived. The Portuguese were the first to bring African slaves to Sri Lanka, formerly Ceylon, using them as laborers, soldiers, and servants. When the Dutch took control over the island, they expanded the slave trade, bringing thousands of Africans from East Africa, as well as slaves from India, East Asia, and Dutch East Indies, present-day Indonesia, to work in Colombo, Galle, and Trincomalee. But the Dutch were playing with fire. These enslaved Africans were strong, skilled, and fearless, and they wouldn't remain silent forever. According to Alan Walter's book Palms and Pearls, published in 1892, the Dutch in Fort Colombo relied heavily on their African slaves to cook their meals, clean their homes, and serve in their offices. But after enduring years of brutal treatment, one night a group of African slaves snapped. They rose up and massacred an entire Dutch family in their sleep. Panic spread through the city. The Dutch, terrified that more revolts would follow, decided they needed to isolate their slaves, not just lock them up, but send them somewhere far from their homes in Fort Colombo. And that's when Slave Island was born. The Dutch rounded up their African slaves every evening, forced them onto boats, and ferried them across a crocodile-infested lake to a small island where they were kept under guard until morning. At sunrise, they were brought back to work in the fort. Any attempt to escape meant a painful death, either by Dutch executioners or the jaws of the crocodiles lurking in the water. The irony in all of this? Well, the Dutch may have feared their African slaves, but they couldn't live without them. These slaves were the ones who built Sri Lanka's most famous colonial landmarks. The massive forts we see in Colombo, Galle, and Trincomalee were built by African, Indian, Sri Lankan, and Indonesian slaves. The grand buildings and roads in Dutch and colonial periods were constructed by the very people who were treated as disposable. It is estimated that over 4,000 Africans were engaged in building the fort in Colombo during the Dutch colonial era. We often credit European colonizers for their architectural achievements, but without the suffering and labor of enslaved men and women, none of these forts or cities would exist today. But here's the surprising twist. While the Portuguese, Dutch, and British saw Africans as nothing more than slaves, the Sri Lankan rulers, particularly the Sinhala and Nayakar kings of the erstwhile Kandyan kingdom, treated them differently. The Kandyan kings welcomed African escapees along with Malays and even European defectors who fled the brutal conditions of the European-occupied coastal belt. Instead of forcing them into labor, the Kandyan kings recruited them as soldiers. Some even held important offices. Africans who had been shackled in chains found freedom and purpose in the Kandyan royal army, serving as elite guards and warriors. Over time, the horrors of slavery in Sri Lanka faded from memory. By the British colonial period, Slave Island became a residential and commercial hub, and the stories of the enslaved people who once lived there were almost forgotten. In 2023, the Sri Lankan government officially renamed Slave Island as Compania Vidya, meaning Company Street, in an effort to erase traces of colonial oppression. But let's be honest, most of us, including myself, still call it Slave Island. It's a name deeply embedded in Sri Lanka's history, and it will take time for people to adjust to its replacement. Even today, old road signs and boats carrying the name Slave Island are slowly being replaced. Today, the descendants of Sri Lanka's African slaves and soldiers still live in parts of the country, but their numbers are dwindling and their history remains largely untold and forgotten. If you would like a separate video on the history, culture, cuisine and contributions of Afro-Sri Lankans, please let me know in the comments below. And the next time you walk through Colombo and Galle, past its colonial forts, cobblestone streets and historical buildings, remember the hands that built them. The European conquerors may have taken the credit, but it was the Africans, Sri Lankans and Indian slaves and laborers who did the real work, without recognition, without reward, and often without hope. And if you found this story eye-opening, don't forget to like, share and subscribe for more untold stories from Sri Lanka's past. Until next time, this is me, Zamir Karim, signing off, uncovering history one story at a time.